think there's so much to talk about in the three previous presentations that I would love to open it up to that. So like I said, I'll just talk kind of briefly about my current work. I do 19th century British literature and culture. And this is my second book project. I'll say the first book project was kind of the thing I thought I had to do in grad school. So I wrote about all white people. I did. The second book project is much closer to why I wanted to study the Victorian period in the first place. My father was from Afghanistan, and I'm close to that side of my family who are all over the world. And some of them spoke English with a British accent. So this was very interesting to me. And in part explained why I wanted to think about the 19th century in Britain and to think about their involvement in Afghanistan over that period, and then certainly the 20th century, or so much more kind of imperialist involvement in Afghanistan in the 30s, 40s, 50s. So this book project looks at Victorian representations of Afghanistan. I've done a lot of work thinking about the British Empire. Afghanistan is often not included in studies of the British Empire. It's often not included in Victorian studies either, even though there were two significant wars across the 19th century between the British and Afghanistan, rather involving the British invading Afghanistan, occupying, setting up a new government, and then evacuating. And all of this was concerned with protecting India, kind of prime colonial possession of Britain, from incursions not only from the Russian Empire, but also Persian and Sikh earlier in this century. So it's a site where there is a lot of kind of pressures coming from the outside. As a place, it didn't have a strong national identity. It didn't have a national identity until the British left it with one at the end of the 19th century. It was a much more kind of decentralized place that had been occupied. It had been imperialized by different kinds of empires, including indigenous ones. But the structure of those empires were really different from the British Empire. And the British never, in fact, colonized Afghanistan. But like I said, they had this kind of pattern of invading, occupying, setting up a new government that they thought would be friendly to their interests, and then evacuating. So the project looks at Victorian representations of Afghanistan. It also, the first piece that I wrote about it, it represents an effort that I'm going to keep pushing towards, although there are challenges, which is to also get Afghan voices in dialogue with those British voices. So there's some challenges with that with the archive, and then sort of 19th century archives in Afghanistan. Some of that stuff is not available, although I understand there's going to be a digitizing process going on in Kabul, which is really great for me to learn about. But there were, for the particular essay that I just finished writing, I look at the Emir of Afghanistan's autobiography. So this is on high. So I'm not getting like kind of what's going on the ground. I'm looking at kind of an official history, or official autobiography that he wrote. And the Emir Abdur Rahman came to power after the Second Anglo-Afghan War in the 1880s. He was not the British's first choice to take over, but he kind of took it anyway. They reluctantly agreed to have him be in charge. And he was kind of notorious for pushing back against British influence. He was also incredibly brutal and tried to kill, he kind of committed various sort of quasi-genocidal actions within Afghanistan in his effort to suppress any internal dissidents and create a modern nation out of a place for which the modern nation form not organic to it, right? Kind of imposed from the outside. But he is credited with turning Afghanistan into a modern nation at the end of the 19th century. But there were a number of poems written about him by the British. There was a poem by Sir Alfred Lyle, who was a kind of British functionary involved in the Indian civil administration. A short story by Rudyard Kipling. You know, Rudyard Kipling's always going to have something to say, even though he never actually went to Afghanistan, although he has a story about being stabbed by an Afghan that there's some discrepancy about. But it gives you a sense of like the kind of fantasy of Afghans that circulate. And then I look at a novel written by Lilias Hamilton that features the Emir. And it's a really terrible novel, and it was torture for me to read, but I did it for the public good. She actually was the Emir's personal physician, so kind of a fascinating woman. In the 1880s, he went to Kabul to become his personal physician and ended up writing a novel shortly afterwards. that features him, and is a kind of historical novel that it tries to kind of tell the story of the nation of Afghanistan and its emergence, but it's all about failure. And in all of these texts, it's about failure. One of the things that I argue that all three of those Victorian literary texts that feature the Emir do is that they all thematize or theorize that Afghan sovereignty is impossible. For them, it's always going to be a failure, and has nothing to do with the Western concept of sovereignty perhaps having internal contradictions, or being imposed, or being partialized, or somehow being diminished when it was given back to the Afghans, but rather it's seen as a feature of Afghanness itself. They're wolves, these are the kind of metaphors that appear in Victorian literature about Afghanistan. They're wolves, they can't be trusted, they trespass boundaries, they know no rulers, although if you know anything about wolves, they're actually extremely hierarchical. But anyway, in the kind of cultural mythology of things, right, wolves know no hierarchy. And Afghans themselves are ungovernable, right? They can't govern themselves individually. They're just run by passion. They're treacherous. You can't trust them. And the Afghan nation as a whole can't be governed. There's no one who's been successful. You can see how those kinds of tropes about Afghanistan that start to form in the 19th century in British representations have carried through to the present, right? So these are still some of the fantasies that the West circulates about Afghanistan, that it can't be governed, that that it is on some level, that any kind of effort at Afghan sovereignty and self-determination is bound to fail. And of course, it's a contention of this project that those are fantasies projected onto Afghanistan from the outside that speak way more to the West's perception of Afghanistan and the categories with which they look at Afghanistan, through which they look at Afghanistan, than anything to do organically about Afghanistan itself. So I have to be very clear, this is not an Afghanistan studies project. That is actually a thing, Afghanistan studies. There's like 5 people working on that in the United States. No, it's a very small field, extremely small. This is not an Afghanistan studies project. I can't make claims about any empirical knowledge about Afghanistan in the project. I really do kind of focus more on what British fantasies about Afghanistan were, and I argue that they have very material effects on Afghanistan. But I am primarily approaching it through those texts. And like I said, I'm trying to shift that a little bit by trying to find Afghan texts that were either translated at the time. That's kind of like, that's my go-to at the moment, like the Emir's Autobiography was translated immediately after it was published and circulated in Britain. But a larger project is going to involve finding texts written in Farsi and Pashto and thinking about how that's going to be integrated into the project. So these literary texts, like I said, they theorize Afghan sovereignty as impossible. They feature Afghans as wolves, but they're really kind of caught in a contradiction, and a contradiction that plays out on the kind of policy level in Britain too, which is the British need to see Afghanistan as sovereign. They need to see it as sovereign and stable. They want it to be a buffer between British India and other kind of encroaching empires. And yet at the same time, they constantly say that it's bound to fail. But this becomes, again, a rationale for invading at will, whenever it seems like appropriate to invade, set up a new government, and then evacuate. But these texts are very much caught within that. What's interesting about the Emir of Afghanistan's autobiography is that he uses some of these ideas strategically within it. First of all, he cites Lyle, he cites a line out of Lyle's poem about him, which is actually, it's a poem about him. He's like a living person, and it's a dramatic monologue featuring the Emir, which is just bizarre to imagine. But apparently, there's something about the Emir that really appealed to the Victorian literary imagination, so that even he's a living figure in a political position. There's poetry and short stories and novels being written about him. He quotes the line from Lyle in his autobiography about how Afghans are impossible to rule, and God, anyone who tries to rule Afghans needs God's help. But he does it in the context of justifying his own brutal violence against, say, the Hazaras or other ethnic groups within Afghanistan. So he's very strategic about how he mobilizes this fantasy, so we can see that happening. But the other interesting thing that he does is he addresses criticisms of his government, which were happening on a kind of global scale. People starting to criticize, particularly British, but also other European countries, just how brutal his rule is. And he turns it around. And he says, well, if you look at Britain in the 19th century, they too have had to quell working class riots in order to secure their nationhood. This is no different. I am doing nothing different from this. So he points to British violence in the internal space. He could have pointed to Jamaica, he could have pointed to the rebellion of 1857, he could have pointed to British violence in the colonies, but he points to British violence at home in England against British subjects, if not citizens, because the working classes weren't citizens until, depending on how much money you made, all that kind of stuff, voting doesn't happen until towards the end of the 19th century. But he does point to that violence that's happening within England against its own people as a justification for his own violence. Which also just kind of reveals the violence inherent to the modern nation form. But he's very strategic, again, about turning the tables and sort of exposing that, that violence that lies within the space of British sovereignty itself in all of its different forms. So that's a little bit about what I'm working on. And I want to just give a plug for Victorian Studies, which has been extremely white for a very long time. But there's a new generation of scholars that I'm like the oldest edge of. But there's these younger generation who are really thinking hard about Black writers and writers of color who are writing from imperial sites, but also from within England, to really kind of undo the sense of Victorianness or of Britishness as white, and to also just, again, just kind of decenter England a bit, even though militarily, economically, culturally, it's still the kind of hegemonic site that is affecting everybody. But there's the brown Victorians, or the brown Romanticists. There are different groups that are kind of emerging among graduate students and a kind of younger generation of scholars that are really starting to problematize that and bring in critical race theory into, again, fields that have been historically very unable to talk about race. Kind of, during the kind of post-colonial turn, developing ways to talk about empire quite powerfully, but not being able to talk about race, to sort of empire kind of standing in for race often in those studies, and that is starting to shift a little bit more. So I'm going to stop there to give more time.